The first step to master the Copenhagen Plank is to let your setup match your strength capabilities. So a lot of times I'll see lifters set up for Copenhagen planks with a variation that's a little bit too advanced for what they're capable of. So then they end up like having their hips overly flexed and they're not getting the most out of this movement for their adductors. So the big thing first is to establish, okay, should I perform this on the floor? Should I perform this on the bench? Should I have a straight leg on the bench? Should I have a bent knee on the bench? I like to have lifters test out different means of doing a Copenhagen plank, time themselves for like a good 10 seconds. If they notice that they are like absolutely gassed, or they're shaking, or they're compensating their form with the variation we start them with, then we'll regress accordingly. And then from there, we can start progressing. So step one is to establish what type of Copenhagen plank setup is gonna be best for your needs. Step two is when you are performing the Copenhagen plank, I want you to think about keeping tension in your oblique that is on the bottom side of your body. So making sure that you're keeping that oblique tight, because that's gonna help then lift your torso up to meet you with what your adductor is doing. So with the Copenhagen plank, we're gonna have our adductor working to bring that pelvis up and to stabilize the pelvis. And then we're gonna have that oblique also assisting, creating some pelvic stability and torso stability. So step two is ensuring that you're keeping tension in the adductor of the leg that is grounded on whatever surface you're using for your Copenhagen plank, and then also keeping tension in the oblique of that opposing side. And now, obviously your torso will be tight as a whole because that is the nature of the Copenhagen plank, but cueing those two areas can be really useful to make sure you're getting your hips and torso into a proper position. Step three is making sure that you're breathing throughout this movement and making sure that your hips are relatively extended. So a lot of times I'll see guys overly flex their hips. And so then what ends up happening is we're taking away work from the adductors, which is the whole point of the Copenhagen plank, if we're flexing too much. Now, it's not the end of the world if you flex a little bit. And honestly, I think having a fully extended hip can be a little bit uncomfortable for some folks. So if you want to start with a slightly more bent hip position, totally fine. And then you could start progressing to doing Copenhagens with a more fully extended hip. But step three is going to be breathing throughout your set, because you're going to be performing these for time more than likely if you're not doing some form of lateral flexed rep with the adductor. And then you're also going to want to focus on making sure that your hips are relatively extended. After that, that is pretty much how you do a Copenhagen plank. The devil's in the details with the setup and how you are breathing and positioning your hips with this movement. And outside of those three like kind of key pillars, they're relatively simple. And as you perform them more, you will start to learn how to position yourself better to get more out of this movement. So when performing exercises like split squats, lunges, and squats in general, you will be getting some passive adductor love with those exercises. So the adductors are always kind of at work when moving through deep degrees of hip and knee flexion. However, I do think it can be beneficial training the adductors a little bit more directly for most lifters. And now, three benefits that come along with the Copenhagen plank is number one, they can be awesome for training the adductor to be strong and stable in a lengthened position. Now, this does not mean you only need Copenhagen planks if you're trying to train your adductors to be as dynamic as possible. I compare them to like a plank in core training. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not an end all be all to make sure you're building a really dynamic and strong core. But when you are training with a Copenhagen plank, you have a lot of opportunity to build your adductor's ability to remain stable in a lengthened position, which can be beneficial in a lot of different contexts and sports in real life. But then also you're going to get some passive benefit for the obliques, and you're going to increase your pelvic stability and your capabilities of managing that. So that being said, Copenhagen planks can be awesome for training your adductors and building their strength, especially in a lengthened context. The second benefit that can come along with Copenhagen planks is I feel like they are a really good entry exercise to adductor training. So they're very easy to scale and modify. And so if you're brand new to training and you notice that your pelvic stability isn't the best, or if you're just not the strongest in the context of your adductor strength, using Copenhagen planks and modifying and regressing them accordingly can be a really good tool to get you kind of into the door with building stronger adductors. The third benefit of Copenhagen planks is that they can be performed pretty much anywhere. So if I'm traveling, for example, and I'm in a hotel room and there's no hotel gym that I can use, I'll do things like push-ups, bodyweight squats, split squats, Copenhagen planks, side planks, planks, etc., because they're easy to perform, you don't need a lot of equipment, and they give you a nice high stimulus because they are typically time-based, and you could modify them to be a little bit more difficult if you have like a chair, for example, or if you're just going on the floor when performing Copenhagen planks. So two quick mistakes that I typically see lifters make with Copenhagen planks is number one, performing them with overly flexed hips. Now, again, you can flex your hips obviously and still train the adductors. We have good girls. We also have other means of training the adductors with a flexed hip. But if you're doing Copenhagen planks, for the benefit of training the adductor in a lengthened position, then you might want to focus on keeping your hips at extension or close to full extension, because that will give you the stimulus you're after. Again though, if your hips are flexed during your Copenhagen plank, it's not necessarily the end of the world. It might just take away from what you're trying to actually train with the Copenhagen plank, and there might be better exercises out there if you're trying to train the adductor from a flexed hip position. The second mistake that I'll see lifters make is not breathing during their set. So similar to a plank, you don't want to be so rigid and holding your breath throughout your whole set. You want to be able to keep tension in your core for a plank, for example, and still be able to breathe and maintain your position. Similarly with a Copenhagen plank, you want to be able to breathe. And honestly, if you want to check this, I would suggest adding some form of flexion with that adductor, so you can bring your hip down to the floor and then flex the adductor, or you can do rotations, because doing this will make sure you are breathing, because if you're not, you're gonna be coming down really fast, because you're not gonna be able to do that much movement without getting oxygen obviously throughout your body. So second mistake that I see lifters make is being so rigid to where they stop breathing with their Copenhagen plank. So 2 fun progressions that I'd suggest trying with your Copenhagen plank if you want a nice challenge is, number 1, letting your hip dip while doing a Copenhagen plank and then bringing your hip back up to a neutral position. This can be awesome for allowing your adductor to flex and extend from a lengthened position. So allowing your hip to come down and then bringing your hip back up, it can be an awesome way to progress this movement. And then you'll use your dips of the hip as reps as opposed to doing time with it. Granted, you could do a capacity set where you are gunning for time while doing that fluid hip dip movement. The second progression that you can try, and this is one that I've been playing with more myself, is setting up on a bench and then doing a form of rotation to where you're taking that arm and reaching through the hole on the ground. So basically bringing your torso forward and going through a little bit of rotation and then opening back up and focusing on having that adductor kind of move with the body. This can also be good for some hip internal rotation as well. So you are getting a nice passive benefit there. Now, will everybody find this movement comfortable? Not necessarily right out of the gate, but I would suggest playing with it if you want a fun challenge. It's a movement that I've been playing with a little bit more to work on hip internal rotation and focus on my adductor strength simultaneously. All right guys, that wraps up my Copenhagen plank guide. I love this exercise because it could be a good beginner friendly exercise for training the adductors, and you could perform them pretty much anywhere with no equipment. If you have additional questions on the Copenhagen plank, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.